Hello and welcome to another episode of whatever the hell I call this show. But anyway, tonight we're doing, well, this afternoon we're doing a debate between John and capitalist Neocon. Guess the topic was let me see what he sent. Yeah, is libertarian compatible with interventionism or not? And I guess since um I'm just a moderator, so I'm going to let just let whoever wants to go first, they can go first and give their opening remarks.
Yeah, you can go first.
All right, I'll go first then. Yeah, the main theme of this debate is whether libertarianism is compatible with interventionism or not. And while for me personally, I'm not libertarian and I don't consider myself small government. If I were libertarian, I still would be an interventionist just because I think intervention doesn't have to contradict libertarianism in the sense that if libertarianism is to stop tyrants abroad, if it's to end state tyranny, if it's to eventually install governments which are more democratic and give people more rights, then ultimately that does achieve libertarian ends through the state where you can help people abroad. And in some cases, really the only case you can do that is through defense. And while diplomacy and sanctions can have some effect, there are some cases where you do need defense. There really is no other option. And for more specific topics surrounding the debate, I would say libertarianism is compatible with a strong national defense where it's fine if they don't want to spend in other areas, but they should be willing to give a free pass to defense. In that government involvement, it can promote overall more liberty as long as it helps people abroad. And then for remaining topics, it's less about libertarianism, more about just the topic of intervention in general. So I'll just say for that topic that I think we'll get to it at the time, and I don't need to pack too much in the opening statement.
All right, and I'll let John give his opening statement.
All right. So I'm what's called an agorist. Basically, it's a form of anarchy in that mostly it's about self sufficiency. Uh, Mostly about building a strong, vibrant community around you and helping others in your community itself. Um, that's this is where I would kind of vary from the Libertarian Party, and that I think you're right about the Libertarian Party would be fine with having a strong national defense, but only for defense, not for intervention or doing anything else abroad. It would just be pretty much just defense. And so there's a number of reasons for that. We can get into that once we get to the question. But forcefully putting your values on other people is a violation of as anyone who knows anything about libertarianism, the non-aggression principle is a huge part of libertarian philosophy. And forcing your values on them, even if you think that they are better for them, is a violation of that and actually does not give them more freedom because they have the right to live under a system that they would choose, not the system that you think is better for them. And I'll go ahead and I'll end my opening statement there, just saying, firstly, government in any form is completely illegitimate. Uh, Although you can have a very small form of maybe like a no bigger than maybe a homeowners association in order for it to be legitimate, because you need consent from every single person in the area in order to have a legitimate government.
All right, so I've not been I've been just following along briefly. I guess I'll ask the first question to capitalist Neocon, which is that um you say that libertarians should be hawks, but again, like if you're going to oppose big government on the domestic level, Why would you support it on the foreign policy level?
Well, for this is like an open format, so like John can speak anytime, so it's not like we just have to give our monologues on this.
Okay.
But I would say that libertarianism can give a free pass to defense because defense can be used to limit state tyranny abroad where diplomacy and sanctions are not always an option just because there are governments where while diplomacy and sanctions can have some effectiveness, at the end of the day it can only help out people to an extent. So I think insofar as it's used for freeing up people, then libertarianism can give a free pass to it for increased government power.
Can I cut in real quick?
Sure.
I would like to ask, what is your definition of defense? Because it sounds to me like you're talking about specific intervention and not defense.
Well, I'd say for defense, I mean, it can be defense in the sense that you're just concerned about whether you immediately get attacked, or
Mhm.
it can be defense in the sense of values, where you defend certain values not just at home, but you're willing to defend those values abroad. So when there's state tyranny abroad, while it may not affect your what goes on within your borders personally, it's still
Mm.
affecting someone out there. So you defend those ideals in other places.
So should we? So we should. I mean, are you suggesting military specifically intervention in these places where there's state tyranny?
Well, I think with state tyranny, it's complicated because it depends on the size of the state, where even for some states where you do have a moral claim for intervention, they're too big that you need to pursue other tactics in the short run before getting to that point. And among some countries, they can be reformed through diplomacy and sanctions quite effectively. So it really does depend on the conflicts, but I'm saying that that whenever intervention is needed, then it should be used then, and there shouldn't be this like hesitancy or saying, "Well, let's just never intervene."
Sure. So would you think that maybe perhaps the UK should be invaded by the US? Are we at that point in state tyranny for them, or Australia even? Uh, I mean, should we be invading them?
Well, I think for state tyranny, if people look at countries that are the most authoritarian versus the least authoritarian, and in the minds of libertarian, there are no like true libertarian countries. However, there is
Sure.
definitely magnitude of state control where
Of
some
course.
states do have more tyranny than others. So I mean, in terms of the UK, even if people think it's a problem, there are countries such as Iran and Turkey which are much more oppressive than the UK. So it
Sure.
doesn't
But
really make
so
sense to go after the least authoritarian country first and then go after the most authoritarian last.
okay. I mean, that's not. So I'm just going off of your definition here of uh, what needs to be intervened with, right? Defending values, right? That was one of the parts of the definition that you gave. Was need to
Yeah.
defend value. Okay, so those two countries, UK and Australia, have completely obliterated Western democratic values, which I assume are close to what your beliefs are. Am I correct on that?
Well, I mean, which context, since it depends on what historical event you're referring to, because
Oh, the last 18 months.
like where so? Like for the UK and Australia.
Yeah, extreme draconian lockdowns, huge like destructions in freedom of speech, obviously freedom of assembly. Um, these sorts of things that make up the cornerstone of Western values, and they have completely
I
stripped
would
those.
actually agree like with the lockdowns where I don't think it's a good idea. And then also the freedom of speech part. That is correct where I'm not saying like the UK and Australia are like the best or the greatest countries or like they represent all the ideals. I'm just saying that there is magnitude where there are problems in the UK and Australia, but if someone's concerned about minimizing tyranny, it makes more sense if they're more concerned about what goes on in Iran and Turkey, for instance, because whatever problem people can cite in the UK, it's at least times 2 or times 3 in those countries.
Sure, but if we're talking about like the effect on the country, right? We're talking about defense of America, right, and American values. Well, we see a lot more like tourism and immigration from the UK and Australia than we would from Turkey and Iran. So those are those people coming over here, bringing their values here. Should we not then force them to have our values based on what you're saying?
I mean, well, for the issue of assimilation, it does depend. Where I do think, in general, that when people come, they shouldn't just come freely. There should be some type of legal process
Sure.
where they can transition to citizenship. But my main point is just with intervention is even if someone agrees that the U.S. has its problems or the UK has its problems, they could at least acknowledge that if the U.S. were to go after a more authoritarian regime, even though they don't like the U.S., it's better because they can counter worse threats that are out there.
Okay, so what threats? You brought up Turkey and Iran. So what threats do they pose that forces us to intervene in their countries? And do you think that so you also expressed earlier, two-part, I guess. You expressed earlier that you want to kind of, I want to be fair with what I say. You want to have them be involved in our I'm really trying to say this without being a dick. You kind of want them to have our values, right? And you kind of want to use the military to do that.
Well, getting closer to having our values compared to where they're at now, it's a long process. It's to get other countries to get similar values. It's not as simple as making Iran the 51st state.
Right, sure.
And I don't support that. I don't support like states that are located thousands of miles away, just because I don't think bureaucracy is very good when you have countries that are physically separated from the capital by thousands of miles.
Well, we definitely agree with bureaucracy being bad. So that's a good start, I guess. But we don't have to spend all of our time on this. If there's anything else, or have I don't know if you have anything else to mention on this subject. Just that the only thing I would add or finish with, I guess, is people don't generally like when you threaten their way of life, even if it is tyrannical. So I'm not saying that like, oh, we shouldn't do anything or that, nothing should be done at all. But there's a reason why these massive groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS were able to take over in these areas. While they gained a lot of support, even from people who normally wouldn't support them because they are extremists in Islam. But there's a reason why, is because they are much closer than we mostly Christian Americans are to their way of life. So when they say, okay, well, we're going to resist this, and you're like, all right, well, I don't really much like the Americans either, so I'm going to side with you and help you overthrow them. It would be the same thing like if someone tried to invade the United States. Think of it this way. Someone tried to take over the United States, and there's some, extreme, Christian evangelical, militant group that is taking over parts of the U.S. and they're gaining ground. You might not be a Christian. You might not be super Christian, but you're probably more likely to side with them than you would, whoever's invading, right?
Well, so I would say for
that we constantly create our own next enemy. Like every single time we defeat an enemy, we've used another group to defeat them, and then those people turn on us, and we're just constantly creating new enemies, and that creates a new justification for war. That's the problem. It's this vicious cycle of defeating an enemy and then creating a new one and trying to defeat that one.
Well, I would say for that it's a false equivalence because let's take the example of the U.S. Nuking Japan in World War II. People could say, "Oh, well, what if Japan nuked America?" But yet, America and Japan represent very different values. So it's basically if let's say you have a capitalist country invading a country that's not capitalist, people could say, "Oh, well, how would you like it if the country that wasn't capitalist invaded you?" Except the ideals are very different. The ideals that they're spreading are very different. So one can support one, but they don't have to support the other.
Well, I think there's a difference in economic policy rather than like cultural value, which is what we're talking about. Cultural value is very, very much deeper ingrained, I would say,
Well, I would
than
say for
some
cultural
economic policy.
values,
Huh?
like for instance, with countries like Iran and Turkey, I don't want them to become atheist or become Christian. My main point with social values is that in terms of state tyranny, it can be less than what it is right now, where there can be governments that are more democratic or less tyrannical against the people. So it's not about imposing atheism or Christianity on them.
Sure, yeah. Well, that was just an example. I'm not talking about specifically just religion, but like democracy is something that is not an Islamic value. They don't hold that. They don't hold equality as a value like we in the West do. At least equality under the law. You know, we hold as a value.
Well, they have different interpretations of equality where even when they pray with the mosque that everyone they try to make sure everyone is equally spaced out or people don't
Right,
get
sure.
preference.
Sure, but
So
they still separate, you know, one side of the men, one side of the women, right? I mean, there's
yeah,
still
in
a
terms of their
separation
views
there.
on women, it is problematic. I would agree
Sure.
with that.
So, I mean, what I'm saying is, would you force them to change that through military means?
Well, it depends on which government, because even among Islamic countries, it depends where. For instance, Saudi Arabia has its problems, but there's other countries which are far worse and take more pressing issue at the moment when
Do you
countries like
know?
Saudi Arabia can be dealt with later.
Do you know why that they're so much less? I guess not that they're not authoritarian, because they certainly are, but why they're at least more westernized, I'll say, than most other Islamic countries. Do you know why that is?
Oh, well, a lot of it was that they were able to secure stable trade with the U.S. and they are a U.S. ally.
Perfect.
And throughout time,
100%. That's why.
they have reformed.
Right, there you go. See, I mean, that does not take military intervention to do. We spread our values through trading with them and not necessarily. So obviously, they haven't made it up to the point that we're at now, but they've gotten better than they were certainly beforehand,
Yeah, so I'm
like
saying
past
intervention in
1,000 or
some
2,000 years
cases,
beforehand, right?
like it depends where for some countries where there's a lesser evil in the region, you should use diplomacy. You shouldn't try to stigmatize them because if you send a message that you're not willing to work with Saudi Arabia, then every other country in the region is going to say, well, if you're not willing to work with them, you're definitely not going to work with us.
Shit, sorry about that.
But I would say for cases where there are regimes that rank among the worst in terms of authoritarianism or the worst among oppression, or if you were to ask libertarians, which countries do you think are the worst and the best to live in? The countries
Yeah.
that are the worst sometimes do justify intervention in order to change the government
But wait, why though?
because they're repressive and they don't have the
Okay.
same values.
So wait, so they're not allowed to have this different values? I mean, that doesn't seem very
But
libertarian,
their
right?
values are
What I'm
oppressing
saying
other
is, like, can you make the libertarian argument for intervention? Because
because among the
I find it
most
very difficult to square that round hole there. You know.
Because among the most authoritarian countries, they don't believe in libertarianism and they don't have libertarianism among their people.
Okay.
So it makes sense to reform the government so that it becomes closer rather than further from libertarianism. And
Okay.
sometimes these governments are belligerent and they're not going to listen. So you do need military action in certain cases to
Okay.
get the government to become less tyrannical,
So
since
do you?
governments don't always just reform on their own. Like, for instance,
Of course.
Iran, you can try diplomacy, but they're still going to have Islamic theocracy for a long time.
So do you remember towards the beginning of our chat, I mentioned the non-aggression principle, which is the cornerstone, the foremost principle in libertarianism and libertarian philosophy. Like, you're not going to find, and so obviously forcing a government to change, especially through military means, is a huge violation of that principle. So I still, I mean, yeah, you can have your own reasons for doing intervention, but I'm saying that I don't think you can find a libertarian reason to do it, even if
Well, I
it
would
is to
say,
spread liberty, because what you're doing is actually not spreading liberty. What you're doing is you're aggressing on a group of people for no other reason than they are different than you, and then
well,
they act differently than you, and that's it. I mean, there's no call for intervention. There's no like the only thing is you would have. I mean, the only people who gain anything are the military industrial complex. I mean, these people, thousands of people lose their lives, lose their homes, lose their work, lose whatever after you're dropping whatever kind of bombs you're dropping. And then, okay, so now we have a democratic government, but you look around and everything sucks. And I know you can talk about like empire building and stuff, right? Like, fixing their
nation
infrastructure or
building.
whatever.
I don't want an empire.
But that's what we have now. We have an empire.
I
We
mean,
don't
how's
call
it
it
an
that. But
empire? Like, where are the colonies? An empire has colonies or would try to convert countries to be the 51st state.
yeah, so what we do now is closer to what the British Empire did. Now, yeah, they had colonies, obviously, especially the United States, Australia, but they also did things like in Africa. They pretty much kind of overthrew the local governments, installed a puppet government, and they ran stuff. They allowed the governor, to run things the way that they wanted to, but you better be ready to trade with us, all the time. And basically, you're a puppet state. They did that with India. They did that with a bunch of Africa.
Well, the thing is with
Some other
India,
countries.
in
But what I'm
terms,
saying is, like, this is what we're doing as the United States. It's still an empire, just because we don't like do every single thing that every other empire has done throughout history. Does not make us less of an empire. It just makes us more of an economic empire than like a conquering empire.
well, I
But it's
would
still an
say for
empire
the
nonetheless.
point on India with the British, the Indian system did improve because of the British, because even in terms of universities, there were hardly any
Sure.
universities before the British. But then now India does have universities that if people work hard, they can go to. It's not just something reserved for the elite. So even if people talk about foreign influence, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because when people say, well, America's trying to influence this country or Britain did try to influence that country, that doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes for these countries, these are countries where they don't have an organized school system, where in terms of the courts, it's basically whatever the dictator says, and they can get a more democratic process. And through the point on economic trade, that's not really a bad thing. And among libertarians, they usually
Yeah.
support free trade.
Of course,
So,
that's the point I was going to make. Was I'm fine with influencing a country or their culture through trade and diplomacy. It's the military intervention where I draw the line.
well, I would say for the NAP argument, I do think there can be a justification, because if, let's say, someone's doing a bank robbery and someone who sees that a bank robbery is going on stops the person from doing it, people could say, well, they're aggressing on the other person, but they're preventing the other
Well,
person from doing a crime.
well, no. So that's the thing, is the person who's robbing the bank has violated the bank's rights of property, being their wealth. And so once he's violated the NAP, he forfeits his own rights.
Well, can I ask you this? Sorry, I'm going to just interrupt you.
Yeah, you're fine.
So, with intervention in Afghanistan, would you say that the Taliban did violate the NAP because they were harassing the other government of Afghanistan, which is the Northern
Yeah.
Alliance at the time?
Probably, yeah, I would say that's fair. Without like going into a deep dive on their politics over there, because not that I'm no expert on Afghani politics of the past 60 years or whatever, but I would say yeah, probably.
Yeah, because my main
I'm just,
point.
I'm just going to ask one. So, would you say that if we intervened against the Taliban, that wouldn't technically violate the NAP because the Taliban did it first?
Okay, so I see what point you're making about doing the bank robber thing, but no, I mean they didn't aggress against us. We didn't really we weren't asked to stop them. And we to be honest, we went over there under false pretenses in the first place, right? I mean, there was no real reason to go over there other than we think Osama bin Laden might be over there. But then we ended up just taking the whole country and then decided to just take over Iraq as well while we're in the neighborhood. I mean, it seems to me like that war was under a lot of false pretenses. We got lied into both of those wars. There's no real justification for either of them.
Well, I'm just going to say one more thing, then I'll just mute up.
Okay.
Massoud did ask, well, the leader of the Northern Alliance did ask for U.S. intervention. But is that justified or something, or is it just
Yeah. See, I'm not sure about that. Like I said, I'm not really up on the whole Afghanistan thing. I would still go towards no, but I honestly don't have a good reason why not.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was just me interrupting.
Yeah, no problem, man.
Yeah.
All good.
I'll let you get back, capitalist Neocon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Do we want to move on to another topic? Because we've been killing this one for a little while.
yeah, we can move on to the other because the other question is very similar to the former.
Okay.
Of the idea of whether government involvement can be used for the purpose of promoting greater liberty or whether it inherently violates liberty. But my main point with the bank robbery analogy earlier is that if there's a third party or if there's a person that sees a bank robbery that's not related to the bank and they go in and stop the bank robber, I would say that it doesn't violate the NAP due to conditions of positive vigilantism. And people could say, well, it's up to the bank to stop it. But either way, whoever stops it, it's subjectively a good thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess that's fair. But again, when it comes to countries, I think there's a little bit more nuance to it, like the pretenses. So, like, okay, so here's an example with going back to the bank robber analogy. If you say, for the simplicity, we say, you shoot the bank robber, right? And obviously that stops him flat, right? So you're a hero, you stopped him. Well, what happens now when you pick up the bag of money and now you're running with it? That's essentially what America did in Afghanistan and Iraq. They were violating people's rights, but then we went over there and did the same thing and took a bunch of resources. I mean, I don't think that makes us better.
Well, as far as the argument that the U.S. took resources, for instance, with Iraq, with a lot of the oil pipelines, they got damaged due to the war or various aftermath of the war. And the pipelines still haven't been repaired today. And part of it is due to the war. Part of it is due to the culture there, where the parliament doesn't want to privatize oil. And there are unions trying to stop the pipelines. So when you don't have functioning pipelines, you can't just take oil and put it in a suitcase. So for the resources idea, it is largely exaggerated as far as the idea that the U.S. just took oil, put it in a suitcase, and left. Where if you don't have functioning pipelines, you can't just take oil. Like if even the people there can't get access to the oil, people in D.C. definitely can't get access to it. So I think that is largely hyped up the point of wars for resources. But regardless, even if it did have some truth to it, is the U.S. in terms of comparing them to the Taliban when they controlled Afghanistan or the Iraqi government under Saddam, the U.S. is far less authoritarian than either of those two. So I would say because morally it's better, it's not a problem as much if they have influence in the region compared to just letting the Taliban have influence or Saddam have influence. Because wouldn't you say it's better if the less authoritarian side has influence versus the more authoritarian side?
I mean, I think that's kind of a false dichotomy there. I mean, there's also the option of not having an authoritarian side, which is the option that I advocate for. So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's just, or maybe they prefer as part of their culture. I mean, Islam in general is a very authoritarian culture.
But
That's
even in
part of the
terms of
reason why they want to kick us out, right? They don't want democracy. Most of them, at least. Of course, there's exceptions, but for the most part, they could care less. In fact, a lot of people, they live, not in cities. They live in like small villages where they have like a tribal elder that's in charge. What's wrong with that? Under democracy, they can't live like that. Like you're incapable of it. That's why we don't have that here, except for like the Indian reservations or native reservations, right? We have some of those, but even them, they're still bound by certain U.S. laws, but they usually police themselves, right?
well,
That was happening under the Afghan, at least in Afghanistan. There was a lot of that, a lot of the tribal, villages and basically living on their own, doing their own thing. And then we come in and now we go through their stuff and take basically conquering their village, even if it's just for a little while, while we search it or whatever. Still, I mean, what do you think that person who lives in one of those villages is thinking? I
well,
mean,
I would say for the
who are
point
these
of
guys, right?
Well, I would say for the point that of whether they approve of the leadership in Iran, it is true that they're not a fan of America, but they're also not a fan of the current government, where even recently, due to water shortages in various regions, there have been massive protests, and people there are not happy with the leadership. And for the case in Afghanistan, most citizens there disapprove of the Taliban, and with the Taliban gaining ground, it's not something that most people want, where they don't want it to be the case that millions of people are not able to go to school or can't go to school as long.
So
And
wait,
that even with some of the guidelines that the Taliban is laying out, I don't think women voluntarily generally want to be forced to stay at home. Otherwise, the Taliban will enforce the law.
sure. So let me ask this though: if the Taliban is not popular in that there's not a lot of support for it, then who's in the Taliban?
Well, it's a minority of Afghan citizens, and the main reason why they're taking control is that even if they're a minority, they're the ones who are more radical and they have more power, where they're the ones willing to use guns and do suicide bombings and do basically what it takes to try to get what they want.
Well, so they have more access to guns, I would say. I don't think that you're going to find many people, and people in general, let alone Afghanis. Like, there's nothing like inherent to them that would make them want to. But I think people in general are willing to use guns to secure peace for themselves. Yet they don't have the access the Taliban has. Do you know why the Taliban has a huge access to guns?
Well, that's going to get to a point in the 80s with the Cold War
Right.
where that requires a bit of an explanation for the
Bit of
Mujahideen.
intervention from certain Cold War superpowers.
But the thing is, with the Mujahideen, that does require some background where the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviets, and the Soviets had 40,000 nukes, and most of them, if the Soviet Union wanted, could launch and hit the US, while the Mujahideen had zero nukes. They weren't even close to getting nukes. So when you have a country that has 40,000 nukes pointed at you, and when you have a country where and among the Mujahideen, some did join the Taliban, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that because of blowback, 9/11 happened. Is it better to try to get a country to end a few years earlier that has 40,000 nukes pointed at you and could kill 100 million people? Or is it better to work with the side to bankrupt that country so that way you can end the Soviet Union, but you are going to get a bit of blowback?
No, I think it's better to not create our own enemies and have to constantly go to war with people that we were arming, a decade before.
But the thing is, the argument of doing nothing inherently helps the Soviet Union, because if we did nothing, that would have strengthened the Soviet Union and that would have weakened the Mujahideen. In other words, that strengthens an enemy with 40,000 nukes and that weakens an enemy with zero nukes. And my point is that it's better to deal with an enemy with 0 nukes than 40,000 nukes, because you can actually deal with them when the Soviet Union's gone.
I think I'm
For
going to push
instance,
back
right
on
now,
you.
we can actually deal with them, while if the
Hold on.
Soviet Union nuked
Mind
half
if
our
I-
cities, we couldn't.
Mind if I make a pushback on you a little?
Yeah, you can.
I just think it's a false dichotomy to mention the Mujahideen would have lost, because there's really no scenario where the Soviets would have won Afghanistan. Now, granted, it probably would have been more deadly if we didn't arm the Mujahideen, but honestly, though, even before we started arming them, the Mujahideen was already taking massive victories against the Soviet Union. Like,
Yeah, I mean, they would have.
us.
Yeah, I mean, they would have likely won, but it still helps if you can tip aside to victory even further compared to non-involvement.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem is though the Soviet Union would have collapsed anyway. Like it wasn't just our actions that caused them to collapse. It's mostly, first of all, communism that caused the country to collapse, right? So yeah, it was propped up and it had a strong economy and it was a strong manufacturing base, but it wasn't sustainable. That was the thing. It was a very short term um, growth. It was extremely short term. It was held up artificially by the fact that they kept taking new territory, and so they were able to get more resources in order to prop themselves up until they can get more. And if they didn't continue doing that, as soon as they got any kind of as soon as they got stopped, which is of course why you would arm the Mujahideen if you're thinking of it that way, is that it sped it up. Sure, I can give you that, but it would have happened regardless, and
Yeah, I mean, I agree
we
that.
wouldn't have to be fighting a forever war again. Now,
Well, I agree that it would have happened regardless, but either way, with a country with 40,000 nukes, it's better if you can bankrupt them even 1 to 5 years earlier. And the point is that if you don't bankrupt the Soviet Union quicker, then you risk even a small chance, even if it's 0.1 to 1%, that they do accidentally launch nukes. And there was one time where they actually did. They were about to launch nukes, but there was one person, Stanislav Petrov, who called it off, and thus they didn't launch nukes. So the point is, when you have two enemies, one enemy has 0 nukes, one has 40,000. You can deal with the enemy that has 0 nukes later once the Soviet Union is gone, but it doesn't necessarily work vice versa. Where if you deal with the Mujahideen and you fail with the Soviets, you can't really deal with the Soviets when even just a fifth of your cities get nuked.
but why would you have to deal with the Mujahideen? Like they're not an enemy at that time.
But I'm saying the point is, like, if you want to counter enemies, there are greater enemies out there where sometimes you do have to work with sides knowing there is going to be blowback or knowing that you're going to get your hands dirty, but you need to do it for greater threats.
So this is more the realist argument, like why we should have supported Pinochet and, like, I guess the Thai monarchy during the Cold War is essentially.
Yeah, because I mean he had problems, but he was better than a Soviet-backed country and basically giving that territory to the Soviets in terms of alliance. So it's more of an argument where you're willing to get your hands dirty to work with certain sides to counter greater threats.
So what do you think about the idea of mutually assured destruction? Do you not think that was? I mean, that was a huge factor in the fact that neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union nuked either one.
Well, that's an argument for bankrupting the Soviets earlier to make sure that doesn't happen and to make sure that even by accident they don't launch nukes due to a miscalculation.
Okay.
Like, it makes sense to try to bankrupt that side quicker. And that's why I said with intervention, it depends, because even if there is a moral argument to invade the Soviet Union, you can't do it because it is, as you said,
it's unrealistic. Yeah.
Destruction. So you have to pursue other techniques to counter them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess we wouldn't. I mean, you could always go back and say, well, we wouldn't have been in this situation if we had done something different. Obviously, we didn't do anything different, so we are where we are. But still, I mean, I don't think that there's any kind of. I think that we have to at least deal with the fact that we create our own worst enemies, and that we've done that now, and I think we should just stop doing that in the future. We should stop creating more enemies for us to have this next, like, oh, here's the next great threat, and then here's the next great threat. It doesn't end. It's just a vicious cycle that goes on and on.
But the thing
Yeah,
is that
I would just disagree with this idea that we created the Taliban because the thing is the Taliban was mostly Soviet created on accident because what happened is that they left a bunch of equipment for the communist government which collapsed, which got in the hands of the Taliban, who were actually refugees in Pakistan who came back after the Soviet.
Sure, sure, but the difference is though they wouldn't have had a beef with us otherwise.
I mean, I don't. The thing is, though, Osama bin Laden, the main reason he got beef with us was because of there was like a dispute with Kuwait. The Saudis wanted the U.S. to liberate it, while Osama wanted to be the ones to liberate it.
Right. And you know who funded the bin Laden family and got them their wealth? The CIA. The CIA did. CIA funded bin Laden and his family and made them extremely wealthy builders. I believe in Kuwait. I believe they were big builders over there in Saudi Arabia.
Well, for that point, I mean, I don't have the specifics on the CIA, and the bin Laden family is different than bin Laden because some members of the bin Laden family didn't really like bin Laden or see him as an outcast. But regardless, the point is, even if it's true that, let's say, the U.S. does create enemies that it has to deal with later, is that my point is that sometimes you do need to get your hands dirty and work with sides you don't like.
Sure, but it doesn't end. That's my point.
Threats out there, and when you counter those greater threats, you can deal with who you're working with now later. Like, for instance, with working with Saudi Arabia against Iran, people say, oh, well, what about the oppression under Saudi Arabia? Guess what? Under 50 to 100 years from now, that can be dealt with, and perhaps there can be an invasion there, but there are greater threats.
So this line of thinking, though, has two possible outcomes. At its end, at its logical conclusion, has two outcomes. Either the United States takes over the world, at least culturally, maybe not like in name, but in culturally at least, or the United States collapses. Those are the only two options with that, as opposed to kind of just letting the world live at peace. I mean, especially letting the U.S. not create more enemies for ourselves. We can do our own thing. We can have, we can even have like protectionism. We can have, free trade. I guess free trade and protectionism are kind of mutually exclusive, but we can have we can have free trade with countries, but not like mess with them. We don't need to continue to create enemies. Like there is a third option that I just feel like, neocons in general either don't take into account or don't want. And I don't want to say like you guys are, just everything that you guys are bringing up is kind of morally repugnant to me. And I'm trying, I'm fine. I'm not gonna start being a dick or anything. But it's pretty horrifying the things that you guys want to do and the justifications that you have for them.
Well, let me make it clear. I don't think I've ever actually justified anything on stream.
I'm sorry? I couldn't get that.
I didn't justify anything on stream, did I?
No, I'm not saying you necessarily. I was just saying neocons in general.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't personal or anything.
Yeah, well, I would say with the point on intervention is I did add that it does have to be calculated because obviously you can't go to war with the Soviet Union or you can't go to war with China or Russia in the modern day. You do need to pursue tactics because even if there is justification too, then that is going to result in far too many casualties where it's better to pursue soft power tactics. But the main point is, as far as influencing countries, I don't view it as a problem when you have a country that's far more authoritarian and you stop the authoritarianism or you lessen it so that people overall have more liberties rather than less. And people can say, well, you had to topple the dictator or you had to do this. But either way, the people in the long run will have greater liberties compared to the alternative of just letting the world do what it wants.
Well, I mean, do the people want greater liberty? Like, have you taken that into account? And so I think what you're trying to do here is just justify it to either myself or libertarians in general. But I mean, that's not going to stand up to scrutiny with any kind of libertarian, any kind of like, actual libertarian. There's some like liberty oriented Republicans that you might be able to sway with that. But like anyone who's actually a libertarian is not gonna be okay with destroying homes and wrecking families in the pursuit of some like greater noble idea of freedom,
Well, the
or at
thing
least
is, as
freedom
far
for other
as
people.
well, the
That's
thing
like
is, as far
the
as casualties from war, it is true that war does have casualties, but in the long run, with some dictatorships, if you do allow them to stand, then more families are going to be wrecked and more people are going to be persecuted. However, the difference is instead of a foreign country doing it, it's happening at home, and they can't get intervention in order to ease what their government is doing to them.
Well, so
let me push back on you, capitalist neocon. Do you want to? I'm assuming you want to spread liberal democracy, but again, if you want to spread democracy, what if the people who you quote liberate are just hate you more and they end up
mhm,
electing someone worse? Because that could
yeah,
also happen. You could overthrow a tyrant, and then the people who, like it'd be like, let's just say
like what happens in South America all the time.
like let's just say hypothetically we remove Saddam Hussein and somehow a Stalinist is elected to become the president of Iraq.
Well, for that, I would say that you can't have immediate democracy because, for instance, in the case of Chile, with that, well, for that, it
Okay.
largely wasn't U.S. intervention. It happened organically. But as far as Allende being toppled and Pinochet being installed in power, Chile, as of now, is a democracy, and it did transition where, even though Pinochet did rule for a little over 15 years, there was a referendum where people voted yes to transition to a democratic process. And nowadays it is a democracy compared to just doing it right away, where there is always that gamble that, well, what if they vote for someone who's worse? Or what if they vote for maybe Allende 2.0? So I would agree there does have to be some transition and a nation building process in order to make sure that certain radical elements like don't seep their way into power, but eventually the goal can be to open up the ballot box, and the main thing is to make sure that relative to what they experienced at the time, that they have more personal liberties today.
Okay, so let me ask you this. It's a little hypothetical. Um, like, do you think that forcing people to have more freedom when that's not what they want? Do you not think that that's a violation as well? That if they specifically want, let's see, let's say like they specifically want this brutal dictator. Is
Well,
you forcing them to be free? Is that not like a violation of their freedom to
Well,
live
I
the
would
way that
say
they
it
live?
depends. Well, I would say it depends why they want the dictator because, for instance, in countries like Iran or North Korea, they may want the Ayatollah or Kim, but the reasoning for that is largely because of state propaganda rather than an organic decision. So it depends on why they want the dictator, where if they want it in the sense they have been exposed to the outside world and they have
Mhm.
looked at various forms of governments rather than state propaganda, and they've reached the conclusion that they just like authoritarianism in general, that's a different question. But usually, among people that do support dictatorships, it is
Uh,
largely due to state propaganda and it's not
so
authentic support.
okay, awesome. Why do you think it is that we, at least in the United States, value democracy? Do you think that's an organic decision, or is that due to state propaganda?
I mean, well, for that, it's usually because people like to choose who's going to rule over them. People generally don't like just someone ruling over them in an ivory tower, and they have no say so over what goes on.
So, do you think that's due to state propaganda that they don't want another system? That there's not another system that they're like, oh well, I'd rather have that.
Well, the thing is that in more free societies, you can actually compare and contrast where you can look at authoritarian countries and you can organically come to the conclusion, well, I like that better. And that is a different conversation if people do live in democracies, but they think authoritarianism is better.
or
But
even
vice
or even
versa,
just
if you live
democracy not being good. I mean, we don't have to get into it, but like I am anti-democracy. I don't think that it's a good thing overall. I don't think it's a net good.
what about democratization, like of the economy, similar to how capitalism works, where you can vote with your dollars and you can choose which products you want. You're
Yeah, a
not going
free
to
market is a
make
different
choosing
thing.
products for you.
Yeah, a free market is a different thing. That's individual choices, not necessarily having to choose between like two different people
So
and
would you
or two different
say,
products. You know what I mean? Like, or,
like,
two of the same product, right? Like you don't have to choose Milton Bradley or Hasbro, right? You in a free market, you have both.
so for instance, in cases like Cuba, where or Vietnam or Laos, where the economy is largely government run, wouldn't you say it would be better for the citizens if there was a system where they could more easily choose the products they wanted rather than having state economies?
I mean, yeah, of course. Like communism is obviously not a good thing. I think we both agree on that.
But do you think intervention could achieve the goal in, for instance, Cuba or
I
Venezuela?
think we've tried and failed multiple times on
Well,
that
it
front.
wasn't really that successful. Kennedy wasn't really serious
That's
about
what
the
I'm saying.
mission.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, we've tried that though. I mean, wasn't
But
that
Kennedy wasn't serious about the mission.
okay? But I mean, even
He didn't
before
even
then,
try that much. It was bare minimum involvement, and people act like he did a full scale war.
yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously it wasn't, but yeah, no. I mean, I would be for lifting obviously any kind of trade embargoes against Cuba and letting them and trading with them. Yeah, absolutely.
But the thing is, if you lift the embargo, that's just going to have more money flow in the hands of the regime versus you can get rid of the regime and you can have a more capitalist system and privatize various industries so that people themselves can decide what to do with the oil or natural resources or food rather than have the state tell them, well, you need to have this much in terms of rations or we're going to spend this much.
Well, they seem to be taking care of it themselves, at least for the moment, right? I
Well,
mean,
even recently, there are a lot of protests, and they're due to food shortages. They're due
yeah,
to insufficient response in terms of health care or housing.
right.
So they're not doing a very good job in terms of taking care of their citizens. And people can even look at the type of cars that they have in Cuba than here.
Yeah,
The type of
they're
cars that they have there are
they're
very
ancient.
different than here.
Yeah, yeah. It looks like they're still in the 50s. Like they have these like full on like steel cars and stuff.
So the point is that in terms of the economy, the current government's not taking much care of it. So wouldn't
So
you say it makes sense to have intervention in order to
no,
have
I would
more
say that
privatized
now
market so
I would
that the Cuban people themselves can decide what to purchase and it's not going to be the state telling them and people can say, "Oh, well, the US still has regulation at home, but it's far less than Cuba. It's much easier to start a small business here than it is in Cuba."
But here's the thing, though: is it like if you replace it with a democracy, though? Isn't it fair to say that there probably is a good chance they would just elect communists anyway, and that
So
you'd
that's
have to essentially run an authoritarian country just to achieve capitalism in the country?
So that's why I would support a transition where, in the short run, you can have a leader align with the US, but the long term goal is to transition to democracy when it's safe. And generally, once people have democracy, most of the time they usually don't want to go back.
I would look at America for a refutation to that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there are
There's
some
plenty of
people
people who want
that
socialism or some like obviously varying forms of it, but there are a lot of people that want socialism in this country. There are people who want communism in this country, right? And I'm talking about like not powerless people. I'm talking about like senators and representatives in the House. Like there
I
are
mean, there are
people who
some
want these
people,
things.
but it's
Well,
probably
they're
not going
popular
to change
too.
the system.
They're popular as well. So it's not like they're powerless. They're powerless to do it, right? It can be done. It could happen.
Well, I would say it's unlikely that the U.S. system, in terms of where it is now, that it's going to change drastically. Where generally, once countries have a parliamentary system, and once they open up the marketplace, people on average usually don't want to go back, or even if some people do, it's not enough to gain enough momentum to change things.
All right. I don't have anything like in front of me to be able to refute that, other than, it looks like every Western country is going more towards socialist and less towards capitalist. Like the European Union, all their member states are all going more towards socialism rather than capitalism.
Wait, even Italy and France?
Um, Italy, I'm not sure about Italy, to be honest. France, weren't they though? At least until the Yellow Vest protest started up. I thought
Well,
they were they not?
well, no, the Yellow Vest protests were like responses to Macron, who actually did more. I think he did a lot more market reforms. That
Right, socialism. Right, Mark. The centralized economy.
Well,
Right,
for
or at least
Macron,
heavily
he's more
regulated.
right wing economically.
yeah,
For
that's what I
more
meant.
specifics on what happened, it is for him. I think it was, I forgot which tax was it. I think it was like
It
the
was a gas
marginal
tax.
tax or
It was gas.
corporate tax that he cut, and in addition,
Well,
he reformed pensions where he cut benefits slightly, and he did other market reforms that the citizens didn't necessarily like. So
yeah,
there's that.
centralized economies. That's essentially what socialism is, right? Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but essentially, socialism is state control of the economy. That's what he's doing with that.
Well, for him, it's more trying to like cut taxes or cut various benefits. Macron's not a socialist.
Sure, no. I didn't say
Like
like
it's
they
more in
they
the
are
other
socialist. What
direction.
I'm saying is that they're moving more in that direction rather than capitalism.
Well,
They're
I'd say
moving more
France is a
towards
bit of an
socialism.
exception where like France and Scandinavia do have higher taxes and they have more government involvement. And that's not to say that I like France or Scandinavia where I would agree. I don't think social democracy and their inclination towards socialism is a good thing. But I just think in terms of countries there are greater threats and among foreign policy it can be the case that you deal with the greatest threats first,
Oh yeah, that's not
then
what I'm
you can
talking about.
start to work your way to lesser threats, and then eventually you can get to a point where you're pretty content with how the world is. And
Yeah,
even if a few places are bad, then there's policies where people can move in and out as long as there's a stable process.
yeah, that's not what I meant. I wasn't talking about like intervention with Europe. I'm just talking about like their proclivity to move towards socialism, as a refutation to what you were saying about like once people are like a parliamentary capitalist system, that they want to stay that way. And so yeah, that's what I'm saying is that they're moving more towards socialism. They do still, of course, they still have their parliamentary system, but we're seeing more and more control, especially the last 18 months, more and more control being centered at the top, right? Especially in the United States, and this holds true for both Trump and Biden with executive orders,
Yeah,
right?
well, I would say
Ruling
like
through executive order is a terrible precedent to set, and that is turning the president, whoever he is, whatever, I don't care if his tie is blue or his tie is red, that's moving more towards authoritarianism. And like just because, and I'm not saying, I don't know which one you support, or if you do support either of them, I don't know, but my entire point is though we're centralizing the power in one person, and like people seem to only care when it's the guy that they don't like that's in the office, but it's like no, they're both doing the same thing. I don't care what color their tie is, they're doing the same things.
yeah, well, I would agree that like with the lockdowns or various like government increases in power, especially with the pandemic, that I would say it's a problem and people and libertarians more so, they can take a lot of issue with the US, the UK and European countries. That's fine, but my point is that they can advocate for reform at home, and they can recognize that they can support intervention in cases where it's far worse. Like, for instance, maybe the phrase feminist for Saudi Arabia seems contradictory, but it's not contradictory when you work with Saudi Arabia to counter Iran. So even if libertarians take issues with the West, they can advocate for reform at home, and they can advocate for intervention against worse countries and reform them more so here, so that instead of having to deal with Iran, you can deal with a country that's more similar to America, and you can complain about executive power rather than complain about a religious run state economy.
Right. So the thing is, I mean, obviously, what is closer to home is going to be more on the forefront of my mind, right? The things that are specifically going to affect me are, of course, going to be the first thing I'm going to think of.
Yeah, I mean, that's
affecting me
natural.
day to day, every day, all around me, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's natural of any person. Like,
of
if a
course,
person is going to think of one person, it's much more likely
not
going to
even
be
just
a
one
family
person,
member
but the
rather than
people
just a
around me as
random
well.
person on the street.
Well, not even that, just like whoever's around me as well. I'm much more likely to think of them and their health rather than, someone 15,000, 20,000 miles away. But at the same time, like that's so, like I'm saying, that's not, I don't know, I guess maybe kind of callous, but it's not our fight. That's
Well,
their
I mean,
fight,
people can
right?
support, like, putting their country first, or among spending, they can advocate the majority of funding for the government being spent at home, but they can
Wow.
advocate for some funding for defense. So you can spend a lot, so you can spend some at home, but
Yeah.
you can also spend some abroad to help people there, because this policy of, well, I care about people here more, that's fine. It's just that the policy of America first, it shouldn't be America only and America alone on the world stage.
Well, no, I mean, it doesn't have to be, but when we talk about military intervention, which is not, in my opinion, the same thing as defense, right? You can do defense as long as it's for defense.
Well, I would say defense, it can mean different things. And defense in the sense of immediate security risks, or defense in terms of ideals, where you spread ideals abroad, and where
That's
there's
not
an
defending,
incredibly
though. No,
authoritarian
but
country,
hang on,
that you
because
spread your values.
hang on, yeah, exactly. Spreading your values by force is not defense. There is no definition of the word defense that could mean forcibly injecting your ideas into another country, especially through military means.
Well, either way, whether people want to get technical on defense or military, either way, in terms of countries that are more authoritarian, through military intervention, they can become less authoritarian. And even one example of this is Japan, where there was the Empire of Japan, and they got nuked twice, but now they have a more parliamentary system, and citizens have more civil liberties than they do. And even among modern day Asian countries, China looks more like Imperial Japan than Japan does today.
Okay.
So
I mean,
that's one
so
example of
they were just,
intervention in Japan, and it worked. It helped out. It helped out the people. Now, relative to if the Empire of Japan continued.
I mean, sure, yeah. So they were another empire, much like the U.S. empire. They were much smaller, but they were gaining ground quickly, and obviously, made alliances with a certain Austrian dictator, failed art student, and that was why we apparently didn't like them. Obviously, then Pearl Harbor happened, and we can get into whether or not that was allowed to happen on purpose. But the point being, yeah. So once they attacked us, we were able to. Okay, now it's considered a defensive war, right? Because we were aggressed upon first. That's how we got the entirety of the United States behind the war effort. Whereas beforehand, there wasn't much popularity for it. There wasn't much like call to join World War II, right? I think that's at least that mentality of like pre Pearl Harbor is just fine, right? Like hey, it's not our fight. Like we're not going to go and send our people, send our sons, and nowadays send our sons or daughters, whatever, to go and die for somebody else. You know what I mean? especially nowadays when the justification for war is much more flimsy than it was for World War II. Way more flimsy nowadays because it's very dubious what the justifications even are, other than like, oh well, we can spread our values. Well, I don't think private first class so and so wants to go and die for some Afghanistan person's rights, right? I mean, that should be their fight. That's kind of the point, right?
But
That
the main
if one of
thing,
our soldiers who they did sign a contract agreed to, serve in the military for X amount of time, but that their lives are not to be wasted, right? Sometimes lives have to be spent. That's true, but there's a difference between spending a soldier's life and wasting it. And every single life that has been ended in Afghanistan or Iraq has been wasted, and that is unacceptable.
I mean, well, I would say that in terms of war, it does have to be calculated in order to minimize casualties. But as far as the point on casualties during war, it is true that there are casualties, but also allowing the world just to be however it be also can have casualties where, for instance, in Afghanistan, when women aren't even able to go outside without permissions of their husband, that's
Mm-hmm.
going to affect at least 15 million people, or when
Of course,
various girls can't go to school, that's
of
also
course,
going to affect a lot of people.
of
And the
course.
Taliban does sometimes kill women, or they kill
Yeah,
people who they deem to be political dissidents, or they say like things disapproving of them. So the point is, either way, there are going to be casualties, whether there's involvement or not. It's just that one is temporary and one is more permanent.
they're all
So
temporary.
I support the one that's more temporary rather
They're
than the
all they're
ones that
all
permanent,
temporary. The
of just
ad,
allowing the world to be how it's going to be.
so all those casualties are temporary, right? The Taliban is temporary. The United States, obviously, temporary, right? Everything,
But there's various degrees.
of
There's
course, but
different degrees.
everything exists until it doesn't, right? That's like the nature of the world. Everything
But
exists until
there's
it doesn't.
different degrees of existing where the Taliban can exist for hundreds of years versus there's a
Probably not.
war, people die, it gets taken out versus just allowing it to continue.
But then we do it
There's
again,
different degrees of
right?
temp.
But then we do it again. The Taliban is doing it in a small area. We do it to Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and then Syria and Libya. Like we're doing it all over the world. Tons of places in Africa that we don't even necessarily know about or talk about all that often. I mean, there's we're doing intervention everywhere. We're causing death and destruction everywhere on this planet, all the
I mean, well,
time.
as far as the point, like on Libya, Syria, and Africa, there's really hardly any involvement there. And among involvement there, it's usually in the form of drone strikes, and it's usually to
Usually,
encounter various militias or terrorist groups there. Like even for instance, with strikes in Somalia recently, that was something that the government of Somalia actually wanted, and so this idea of just the U.S. being reckless or just bombing places for the sake of it,
no, no, no.
that's
That's not what I'm
something
suggesting.
where it can get overlooked.
It's all highly calculated and planned, thought out at least. Maybe not planned out necessarily, but thought out for sure. They're not going to bomb somewhere if they don't have somewhere to gain something to gain. Of course, they're not doing it for the sake of doing it. That's not what I'm suggesting. All I'm
Yeah.
saying is that, like, saying, okay, well, we're going to end this regime in order to put someone in charge who's going to be less tyrannical. Okay, that's great, but we're still doing that. We're doing that over and over and over and over again all over the world. It's not going to stop. We're just going to constantly be changing regimes and whatever. Like the plan that I imagine you would have, and stop me if I am incorrect. That you want to kind of adjust the world's regimes, especially the most authoritarian ones, to less authoritarian ones. But most of that, especially with the more authoritarian ones, is going to take military intervention. It's going to take bombing of infrastructure and bombing of whatever, like military targets, obviously. But tons and tons of murder and straight up murder, not just like killing, but like murder. It's going to take that.
Well, killing enemy combatants is different than murder. It
Eh,
depends on who's killed. If you kill like someone like Osama bin Laden, that's not murder. Those are two different things.
I mean, if that helps you sleep at night, that's fine. But No, I mean it's all. So it's not. I'm not even just talking about just Bin Laden himself. I'm just talking about just all these casualties in war in general, including our own people.
Well,
Obviously,
would you?
it's not always drone strikes, right? There's people on the ground, especially in Afghanistan, Iraq, um, and the like. It's not, but like it's especially if we go into Iran now, that's a whole other thing. Now that's going to be another 20-year war. You know what I mean? Like it's just not going to stop ever, and at least until the two things that I brought up, right? Either the U.S. collapses or we take over the world and our the world empire, basically, which I don't
Well,
think either of us wants, right?
with as far as the empire, I mean, I don't support an empire, but I don't have a
But
problem with the
your
U.S.
policies
exerting
that
influence around
the
the
policies
world.
that you're advocating suggest an empire.
Well, I mean, either way, however technical people want to get, I don't have a problem with the U.S. exerting influence abroad. And we can start to get to a break since it's the middle of the debate. But I'll just say, as far as the point on casualties among authoritarian governments, they can't commit a lot of casualties and they can be brutal. Like, even, for instance, if the Taliban's left unaltered, people are still going to get killed and people are
Yeah, of
still
course,
going to suffer.
of
But
course.
the question is that under some cases, in the case of war, a lot of people suffer, but that's temporary. Where once you get the war over, like for instance in Japan, people did die, but nowadays they're the third richest economy in the world compared to just saying, well, Imperial Japan can do what it wants, and to this day, their economy in terms of state tyranny, it would be far worse if Imperial Japan was around compared to the Japan today. So I would just say that there are casualties, but there are also casualties due to non involvement. It's not something where someone's morally innocent if they say, I'm not going to get involved. But we can start to get into, at least for this segment, closing remarks and then like around a 5 minute break.
All right. Um, so I guess I would just want to respond to what you said about, it would be worse if we didn't get rid of the Empire of Japan. I suggest that there's no way that you can possibly know that either of us could know that. So there's no way I can know that it wouldn't be worse, or that it would be worse, or that, I'm sorry. There's no way that I could know that it would collapse, or like, that it just wouldn't be as bad. And there's no way that you can know that it would be worse, right? Do we agree on that?
Well, I would say there's no way of knowing 100%, but people
Right.
can make predictions or analysis which do have strong correlations or can suggest that it would have been worse.
So from what I know of what they were planning, they pretty much would have just taken like Southeast Asia, which I mean, while they did invade China, they probably would have gotten a lot of pushback from that. I think they would have been stymied in and around China, Vietnam kind of area, um, Korea. They in Korea, Japan and Korea are both ancestral enemies, along with China, of course. Um, so I don't know. I think that there's an argument to be made that they wouldn't have been able to spread too far either. What they were doing were taking islands, which I mean, for people of their size and of their ferocity, they would find that pretty simple, right? There's these tiny islands that have almost no defense, right? So that's what they were doing. They were taking islands, hundreds of them, and then they moved into like China and Southeast Asia in general. Um, I don't think that they would have gotten further inland, and that if they hadn't done Pearl Harbor, I don't think that they would have been much of a problem. They wouldn't have been a huge player in World War II. But since they attacked us, right, we justifiably attacked them back, and we ended up losing a lot of U.S. soldiers in that. A lot of ships, a lot of planes, a lot of soldiers, like a lot of boots. You know,
Yeah, well, I would just say on the World War II part is I do advocate a different strategy for it, but that's good. That's going to have to be an entirely separate debate
sure.
for my views on it because that's going to require a lot more nuance. But I think for
Yeah,
this, we can have like Grayson. Do you want to have start a 5 minute break or so, and then we can come back?
All right. I didn't know it would be this long. I didn't know this would be only the half-minute mark, but
Wait, what?
I wasn't aware this was only going to be the half-minute mark.
Oh, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't have to be. I'm good for whenever.
I mean, I'm good for whatever. I mean, we can take a break now and then just finish off.
Yeah, I mean,
give
how,
it for now.
how many questions do we have left?
Two, but they're shorter.
Okay, yeah. So we don't have to go for another hour.
Okay.
Yeah, we just do however long.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll see you guys in about 5 minutes.
All right.
All right. See ya.
So, hmm. Let's see. I don't know what to talk about here because there's no one in the chat, but guess I'll just talk about.
All right, I'm back.
All right, so Grayson said in the private chat that we can start without him since with the
Okay.
moderator there's not too much of a need. So,
Yeah,
but
yeah. I mean, I think
yeah,
we're pretty. I was gonna say I think we're doing pretty good at not interrupting each other, but then I interrupted you, so I guess that's wrong. But no.
yeah, that's fine. So I guess for the final two segments, this segment is in what cases is intervention and war justified, and the final is more a debate on incrementalism versus radical change, but
Yeah.
that's not quite as important.
Yeah, I think we're gonna agree quite a bit on that last one.
Yeah. So for cases where I would say intervention is justified, intervention does need to be planned out and well coordinated because even you said there's two possibilities for intervention. Either eventually most of the world does look similar to the US or the US tears itself apart. So it does have to be thought out because, for instance, if someone said in the 80s, let's nuke the Soviet Union, then that's obviously a bad idea. So I would say for cases of intervention when there are severe authoritarian governments and when it's so that they're smaller than the US, so the US could easily win if there was a war, then I would say it's justified. And also, in some cases of humanitarian intervention where there's problems at home, and also if they pose a national security risk. In general, if they don't get on good terms with the U.S., they should start counting their days that they have left.
Yeah, see, that sounds extremely imperialistic. I know you said you don't like empire, but that's how empires act. It's you know, do as we say, or we're gonna come over there and make you. That's essentially what you just said. Am I incorrect on that?
Well, I mean, in terms of empires, it depends because I don't want them. I don't want other countries to be colonies, or I don't want more than 50 states. I think that there
Sure, but
may
but if it's the
be
same
countries.
effect, if it's the same effect as having a colony without it being a colony, I mean that's just a distinction without a difference.
Well, either way, if people want to call it an empire or not, or like I still would support countries becoming more similar to the U.S. rather than less similar.
So I would support that as well, but I think we would go through different means of doing so.
Yeah, because I would advocate in some cases you do need intervention, and as far as spending, we can get into that, but there are ways that you could spend more on defense while still balancing the budget. So I don't just want to borrow a ton of money for these wars. I actually want to be able to pay for them.
Right, but so how? Okay, okay. I mean, I don't want to get into that. That's an extremely boring topic. Getting into like how we're supposed to pay for these wars without borrowing a shitload of money. But we don't have to get into that. That's fine. The only time that I would say like war is justified is if we're attacked, or if we're attacked first and without provocation. Right, that's a big thing. Without provocation. I mean, if you're poking somebody, over and over again, and then they turn around and punch you, you got what you deserved, right? Like you were messing with that person. But
Yeah.
if you're just walking down the street and then someone comes and clocks you, all right, well now you have an excuse to get up and beat the crap out of that person, right? I think we agree on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so individually, those
Right,
cases
but if
work.
someone,
But I
but if
think
you see
countries
someone that's
work
looking at you
different than
mean,
individuals.
but if you see someone who's looking at you, oh, okay, but I'm doing an analogy of the country is an individual.
Yeah, I mean, I do
Right? So I
get
mean, if
the
someone's just looking at
analogies
you
from.
wrong and you go and you hit them, you're the one in the wrong
But
at
the
this
only
point.
thing that I would just say is that at an individual level, there is a sense of a rule of law where, for instance, if you do think that someone is going to preemptively attack you, you can call the police. But on the world stage, if a power is they're not aggressing, but they're expanding and they're adversarial to your interests, you can't really call the world police or resolve it. And people can say, "Oh, well, you can just contact the UN."
We
But
are the
the
world
UN really
police,
can't
dude.
do much. It's more just so a forum, and forums can't do much. They can help. They're better than nothing. But
No, no, no.
but the
No,
point
no,
is
no.
at an individual level, you have the police you can call worst case scenario. And it is true the police has its problems, but at the world stage, there really is no police you can call whenever there are issues.
No, we are the police.
Well, it's better than not having a police.
I
Because
disagree.
then that's anarchic for the world if you don't have a police.
I mean, I disagree. I think that the world would be a better place if we didn't have the police.
Because if America was deciding what's right and wrong, it's better than just this attitude of, well, let's have it be whatever, as long as other countries want it. Like if Iran has to listen to us and say, well, you can't do this to women and gays, I don't take issue with that compared to what they're doing right now.
I mean, that's nice and all to say that, but then at what point, okay, so at what point is military intervention justified in Iran? Like, at what point do we send the boots in? Do we drop bombs? Like, at what point are we doing that? Or are we doing a formal declaration of war against the state of Iran, or are we just doing what we did with Iraq and Afghanistan, where we don't have congressional approval? We just kind of do what we want anyway.
Well, for the cases of Iraq and Iran, that did get congressional approval in terms of the authorization.
Yeah,
and
eventually.
in terms of the wars for Iraq and Iran, I would have handled them differently. Where if people are going to say, well, there are problems with Iraq, or Iran has influence in the region, or there's still terrorism, I would agree that the wars could have been handled better. But people oftentimes, when they say there's problems, that's usually just they're making an argument for non-entrance rather than, well, it could have been handled differently. So my point, I would say for Iraq and Afghanistan, it's not really a question of whether we should have gone in. It's what the strategy should have been. And for cases of Iran, I do think that even as recently as perhaps 1 to 2 years, that the U.S. could actually gear up for war with Iran and could pay for it. So I would be fine if the U.S. was gearing up for war with Iran in even as early as 2022.
So you think that it's justified now?
Yeah, I think it's justified now because
what's the justification? Oh, go ahead.
Because there's been decades of rampant oppression in Iran that makes the U.S. look like a free state compared to what Iran does.
Sure.
So and there's security arguments for Iran, but even on just humanitarian grounds alone, it's justified based on what they've done to their people in the terms of having a state economy that's run by religious people who have no idea what they're doing, in terms of the fundamentalism that's enforced upon them, in terms of women not being able to work in certain professions, or political dissidents getting executed.
Sure.
And even on just humanitarian grounds alone, there's enough to justify intervention.
Now we're going to get back into
the argument.
Now we're going to get back into, though, about, like I said, about forcing your values on people, right? Like the reason why people side with extremists that they otherwise wouldn't is because those extremists are closer to their own beliefs than those that are invading them, i.e. us, right?
Well, in the case of Iran, it's
Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, whatever.
But people don't like the government as well. People are not happy with the current government. Okay, so it's not like they're big fans of the Shiite theocracy that's going on right now. They don't like the current leadership.
So then why don't they overthrow it? If it's that unpopular, then they should have all the support in the world, right?
Well, there are protests going on, but the problem is when people protest, then they get shot in the street. So what kind of message does that send if you don't like
that? Makes people more hardcore against the government is what that does. Every single time the government cracks down like that, it makes more anti-government militants.
Yeah, but what happens is when you're in the country, let's say you live halfway across the country and you have largely state media and you don't hear about those stories. Because when you have a country where it's largely state propaganda, people can say, well, even among the people that support the leadership, they can say, oh, well, the leadership has support. But then again, a lot of that support is manufactured. It's not genuine.
Of course. But okay, so then how do you know that there's this much anti-government sentiment if the state-run media So, I mean, how do you know about these numbers? Whatever numbers they are, you don't have to give a specific number. I know you don't have the information in front of you, but how do you know this information if it's all state propaganda? Like you would think that there would be almost no anti-government sentiment if the media is not controlled, which we know obviously even with complete control, there's always going to be dissent, right? I mean, you can see that even in North Korea where they have absolute control over everything and there's still dissent. People still, leave the country or escape. Um, but yeah, no, my point is, how do you know that there is this anti-government sentiment in Iran?
Well, among Iran, there like have been a lot of activists which used to live in Iran that like are against
Right.
them, and even in terms of some of the laws that they have, like for instance even just alcohol restrictions or
Well, that's an
various
Islamic
other
thing.
laws on civil liberties, they have a hard time enforcing it, and people don't always follow the laws. So
Mhm.
if let's say you have a law that says, well, you can't do this thing, but people are still doing it. What does that say? Does that say that the people are like the government, or does that say people are basically giving an informal middle finger to the government that you can't tell me what to do?
Well, so I mean, do you think the same thing about like the drug war here in the U.S.? That
Well, the drug war, that's a different topic here, but the
well, yeah,
point
but I'm
is
saying
that
for the
that
equivalent of
the
the alcohol
restrictions here,
restriction.
that even from a libertarian point of view, the restrictions here are less than they are in Iran. Where in
Yeah,
Iran
of
you
course they
can't
are.
drink, here when you're over 21 you can drink. So
Yeah.
whatever restrictions people want to cite here, it's worse in Iran.
No, no, I'm not saying that's worse. What I'm saying is that do you think that someone okay, so like I mean, marijuana is mostly legal in most places. So let me give a different example of like, cocaine. Do you think like doing cocaine in the United States is an anti-government action that is saying like, I don't like the government because I do cocaine? Or do you think someone's just doing cocaine because they like doing cocaine?
Well, for that, it's a variety of reasons. I think part
But I'm
of
saying
it
it's the same thing
can
for
be fueled
alcohol
by
though over there.
anti-government sentiment. I do think part of it can be fueled by anti-government sentiment, where even
Sure.
among people that do hard drugs, like even historically, the hippies, they were one group where I don't know if it was cocaine, but they did do hard drugs. Like you could
They
tell they were on something.
they most of the time
Or
they would do hallucinogens though. They did like LSD and mushrooms and stuff.
yeah, and they largely didn't like the U.S., where
The
they
government,
hated
yeah.
U.S. involvement. They didn't want U.S. values to be spread abroad.
Yeah, fair. Well, it's more like that they didn't want to intervene in other people's lives. So, I mean, okay, so let me put it this way then. Well, essentially, let's go back to an individual to make it, an easy analogy. If someone came to you and put a gun to your head and said, you have to be a Christian right now, and from now on, you're going to be a Christian or I'll be back, are you going to like that person? Are you going to, I mean, you're going to follow those values, I imagine, for a little while, at least as much as you have to, in order to show that okay, well, don't shoot me. But are you really going to believe that? Are you really going to? Is that going to inform like your livelihood, your life,
Well, I
or are
can
you just
say
going to kind of do what
personally
you got to
that
do to put your head down and not get shot? That's what we're doing when you say we need to spread our values abroad at the point of a gun if necessary. Well, it's the same thing as like forcing, like you're trying to say, force people not to be religious, or at least not as restrictive on their religion. But what you're doing essentially is someone forcing you to be Christian at the
well,
point
I
of
would say
time.
for the case of Iran, it would be different where currently the state is already doing that. They're already like as you said,
Okay,
forcing
but
people that well, you have to adopt these norms. So the point is that you focus on taking out the leadership while minimizing
right,
casualties among the people.
I'm
And when
making a
you have a
moral
new
argument though.
government,
Not a,
the new government will allow people for themselves what to decide in terms of civil liberties. It's not going to have the Ayatollah currently deciding for them.
right. I'm trying to make like a moral argument here as opposed to a policy one. So, and I know that I mean, you're an atheist, right?
No, I wouldn't
Oh,
consider myself atheist.
okay.
I, I would consider myself strongly theist, where I do believe in God.
Okay, fair enough. So then, okay,
But I
so
wouldn't
if
consider
someone,
myself Christian.
okay, but if someone, okay, then someone puts a gun to your head and says you have to be an atheist, then. You know what I mean? Like, and that's happened in the past in Christianity, right? Maybe not atheists in particular, but they had to be whatever other religion was
Yeah, in the
around.
early days of the Roman Empire, it
Yeah,
was paganism that was enforced.
right. What but was that morally justified?
I mean,
They
well,
need to
I would
spread their
say,
values, right?
well, I'm against restrictions on religious freedom. I think that's one area where I actually would agree with libertarians on civil liberties, where I do think people should be allowed to choose what religion they are.
Okay, but yeah, I mean, you understand what I'm doing here. This is just a moral analogy. I'm not saying necessarily forcing someone to be religious. Like, it's not literal like that. I'm just saying, like, someone enforcing their own values onto you, whether you like it or not, is what I'm saying. So it could be
But
any value. I just chose religion to be simple.
But let's say that someone's currently, let's say the Ayatollah is forcing you to adopt certain values. Someone takes out the Ayatollah, they're also enforcing certain values. However, they're less restrictive and they give you more freedom. Would you say that's an improvement relative to what's going on right now?
I don't think
Where
that's what was
even if you
happening.
both, where even from the libertarian point of view, even if you both regard Iran and the US as forceful regimes, wouldn't you say you would prefer a more benevolent one that's going to give you more civil liberties or be more lenient rather
For
than one that's
me,
more harsh and more restrictive? For instance, with the Ayatollah in the US or whoever the US leader would be in Iran.
I mean, so would I prefer? I mean, obviously, yeah, I would prefer if someone is more benevolent, but that doesn't mean that that's something to be worked towards. I'd rather work towards, in my view, getting rid completely of any kind of ruler.
Because this is something that even Murray Rothbard talked about and he wasn't in favor of intervention, but even in terms of voting at home, he understood the idea of picking a side and that voting is morally justified, where even if they're both as
I
ANCAP
am
think of
not
them
sure
slave
that you
owners,
understand what
you
Murray
can have a
Rothbard.
more benevolent one. You can have one that gives you more civil liberties versus one that gives you less. So even among two terrible options, one can be more favorable to you. So he did understand the point
Would have
of why.
understood the. He might have understood that point, but I don't think he would have advocated for that point. I mean, he was,
I said for the point of voting, so he understood
but
the
even
value
voting,
of picking a side at home. However, what I'm saying is with intervention, not only do you have to pick a side at home in order to help people in your country, you can pick a side abroad to help people. You don't have to just see the world as it is and say, well, let's just have it be this
you
way.
see, that's what I'm saying. I don't think he understood what
You
Rothbard is
can
talking
actually have
about.
better options.
Right. So so I don't think that you understood what Rothbard was talking about in that case. And I don't know the exact, context of what he was talking about or what book it was in, but what you're talking about though essentially is the lesser of two evils option, and libertarians are extremely against the lesser of two evils option because that's a false dichotomy. You either have this more evil or this less evil. Well, that's not true. We can always choose no evil. That's the libertarian position, is to choose no evil.
But the thing is, if the end goal is no evil, you can still have a transition where
Yeah.
you get less rather than more.
Well, we can
Like,
talk
for
about
instance, if let's
during that
say
during
there's a
the.
politician, like, let's say there's a politician where they're corrupt, they're going to steal $100 billion versus there's a politician that's going to steal 10 billion. I mean, I would agree stealing's wrong, but I would
No,
pick
so
the
you
one
hang them
that's 10
both.
billion
That's my point. You
because
hang them
you try
both.
to minimize suffering. The goal
No,
is to
no, the
minimize suffering.
harm reduction is bullshit. And sorry for my language, but no, harm reduction is ridiculous because it's you're still causing harm, and all you're doing is drawing a line saying you can still harm, but just don't cross this
Well,
line.
you're not
Well,
approving
that's
of it. It's
bull.
just
I
that
mean,
you realize pragmatically what's going to happen
no, pragmatically,
and
you
you
can
try to
hang both
minimize it
politicians. Doesn't matter
relative
how
to
much they
what the
stole.
options you have.
You can get rid of both of them.
Yeah, but you can work towards that end goal in addition to trying minimizing suffering in the short run. You can do both. It's not an either or. You and that's my point is that I even said earlier with like the UK and Europe, if someone's in France, they can advocate for privatization of the economy. They can advocate for ending the lockdowns but they can also advocate for intervention against Iran. Those two are not incompatible. So they can advocate for harm reduction, and they can advocate for the end goal of eventually getting to a point where they deem it's no evil. But my point is, even Murray Rothbard, someone who was an anarchist, he understood the idea of lesser of two evils.
Yeah, he understood it. I don't think he advocated for it. Understanding something and advocating for it are two different things.
Well, the whole point, he saw the value of it at home, but I'm just saying that when people think of choosing options, they think of voting. But you can also vote abroad in the sense that when you intervene, you can support the Ayatollah now.
Wait, so what business do I have?
Form of government, which is better than the Ayatollah, and I picked the American form of government.
So wait. So what business do you have to choose their form of government? Right? I mean, that's the crux of everything we've talked about today in this entire stream. Is what gives you personally the right to choose what their form of governance is?
Because one's morally better if you believe in morals at home, where you're confident.
So one's morally better. Morals are subjective.
And just apply those morals abroad.
Morals
because unless someone's apolitical and they don't vote and they don't have a strong conviction, then that's a different topic. But if someone's confident enough to vote at home, they should be confident enough to vote abroad in the sense of intervention or supporting various sides on what they think is better.
Right, but those people that you're voting to change they don't get a vote. You are an outside person, a third party, deciding how someone else has to live their life. That is morally repugnant to me.
But let's say you're choosing someone that's going to give them more civil liberties than what they have now. Like, is that a bad thing if you give someone where, while they have problems?
Yeah, if they don't want it, yes. If they don't want it, yes, that is a bad thing.
But what if it gives them more libertarian values? What if it gives them
if they don't want it, then that's a bad thing. Forcing your values on another person is a bad thing.
So, like, would you say that libertarianism is objectively good, or it's only good if society approves of it?
No, not society. Screw society. Morality is a subjective thing for each person, right?
But your kind of point is you're basically saying, well, if people don't want civil liberties or if people don't want values that are more aligned with libertarianism, then they shouldn't get it. So it's just kind of weird.
They shouldn't get it.
If people don't want those values, they shouldn't have them.
That's not what I'm saying. No. I'm saying if they don't want those values, then those values should not be forced upon them at the point of a gun, is what I'm saying.
But the point is, either way, it is because the current government in charge is already doing that. So the point is, you have someone where they're going to do it less so than what's going on right now.
Not less so.
So for instance, with Iran, if it's not the U.S. telling Iranians what to do, it's going to be the Ayatollah. And I don't trust the Ayatollah that much more than I trust the U.S. I think the Ayatollah would be worse if he's allowed to tell people what to do compared to the U.S. So either way, somebody's going to tell someone else what to do. It's who's it going to be, and I want the better option. I don't want.
No, see, that's the thing.
I don't want the Ayatollah telling people what to do. I don't want Assad telling people what to do.
This is what I just said, though.
I don't want Allende telling people what to do.
This is what I
want
said.
the U.S. rather than those countries.
Argument. The lesser of two evils argument is not a good argument. That is just a justification for evil, so long as you're not as evil as the other person. That is not a good thing.
Yeah, well, it's
difference of saying like, okay,
advocating for minimizing suffering. That's the position of minimizing suffering relative to what's going on right now.
But it doesn't, though. It doesn't minimize suffering because we're still causing these problems. Decades and decades. Arming people to overthrow a government who then becomes the government, and then now we have to arm someone else to overthrow them. Like, it's just this vicious cycle. It's going to keep going. It doesn't stop. So we're not actually reducing harm. We're just changing regimes over and over again, just changing who's doing the harm. That's all that's changing. The amount of harm is still the same. It's just that we're changing the face of the harm. That's it.
But for instance, if let's say there's a company where maybe they do X amount of harm, if we want to quantify it, and they get a new manager, the new manager does does 1/2 times X's amount of harm?
Okay, but you also
Do you
fired
think
half
that's
the
a
employees
meaningful
to get the new
distinction,
manager. That's what I'm
or
talking
do
about.
you think that both managers are comparable?
Or you had to fire half the staff in order to get the new manager there. So now everyone's working double shifts and making less money because
No,
they have to
but
take a
my
pay cut as
point
well. You see what
is
I'm saying?
just
Like
that.
it's more than just one. Like okay, we're putting somebody else in charge. It's not just one thing that's happening. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of things that's going on.
I'm saying the
Otherwise,
point is that if you minimize suffering, that's a good goal to have. And sometimes you do have to be pragmatic. And even I said, like, even when you brought up the Taliban, where some members of the Mujahideen did join the Taliban, sometimes you do have to get your hands dirty, and it does suck. And that's one thing with what's called Kirkpatrick Doctrine, or working with various nefarious actors that aren't good, but they're better than the option, where that's not an endorsement of them. That doesn't mean people should big up Pinochet or Suharto or do
right?
helicopter memes or say, well, Suharto killed atheists, therefore he was base. But that does mean you work with them, because if you don't, then the Soviet Union's going to expand their influence. And instead of Chile being, let's say, a puppet state of the U.S., which I would say it's not, but even if it was, it's far better than being a puppet state of the Soviet Union. So
All right.
sometimes you do have to get your hands dirty to work with greater evils, greater threats that are breathing right at your neck.
All right. So I think
this entire conversation just seems pretty redundant because you
I
seem
was
to argue that
yeah.
lesser of two evil.
I was going to say the same thing that we're just talking in circles at this point. So we
Yeah,
so
it
we
seems
can move
like
on.
it's more talking in circles. So
Yeah.
I think we can move on to the final topic. I think this is probably where there will be more agreement. Like,
Yeah.
should changes in society, whatever they may be, occur incrementally throughout time or drastic and immediate for end results? And I would say for this, that I support incremental change. And there is some psychological reasons for it, where even there's one book called The 48 Laws of Power. And
Yeah.
Robert Greene talked about that even if people say they want change, and while change can be effective for campaigns, people ultimately, even if it's for good reasons, don't want drastic change, where it does make them like, it does turn people off, or it turns people against whatever the change if it is, if it's too drastic. So I would just say I'm an incrementalist for this, where I support incremental change for society.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that as well. That it's definitely better for incremental change, especially for like you said, psychologically. I mean, I'm not really too bothered either way, because I mean, so my plan, and this is what most agorists will tell you, is that I plan to do the most I can in my life, regardless of the restrictions on me, to be as happy as possible, to be as successful as possible, and to be as self-reliant as possible, so as to at least do my little bit to starve the government of funds, right? So doing the best that I can to pay as little taxes as I can, so that the government's getting less money from me. And that's all that any one man can do for themselves, especially with how we are right now.
Yeah.
I'm not saying like, oh, tomorrow we're going to have Ancapistan. You know what I mean? Like, that's never the plan. It's not a utopian thing. It's more of, I have my plan to get my cabin in the mountains and have a small garden, have a couple of chickens and, a couple of goats maybe. You know what I mean? Doing the most that I can do to be self-sufficient and not have to interact with the government as much as possible, right? So that's what I can do, and then what I can also do is try and convince other people to do the same. So that's kind of where I come into with like incrementalism, but it also doesn't matter to me because I'm going to do what's best for myself and my family in order to live by my values.
Yeah, so I guess for this, like, one question that I would ask is, let's say there was a libertarian politician or that
Mhm.
had like a 20-year plan towards Ancapistan versus they had a 5-year plan. Which one would you be more inclined to support? The 20-year
So
plan or the 5-year plan?
I was actually a big fan of Justin Amash, who tried to get the nomination for the Libertarian Party in the last election before Joe Jorgensen got it. Now, I think it was mostly tongue in cheek, but his plan was day one, like abolish the federal government. So I was a big fan of that.
I think that was Adam Kokesh.
Adam
That had the
Kokesh. You know
plan.
what? I think you're right. I think you're right. That was Adam Kokesh.
Yeah, Justin Amash was more pragmatic, where
Or
he
yeah,
was
you're right. I got
like,
those
yeah,
two
I mean
mixed up.
that's one example. Like, would you
Yeah.
support day one just get rid of the federal government, or like a 10-year plan towards that and
I
cap
think
system?
I think pragmatically a 10-year plan is better because you have so many people who are reliant, unfortunately, tragically reliant on government subsidies that we need to wait to kind of wean people off of that. But at the same time, I'm not really bothered either way. So yeah, so I mean, if I have my own preference, incrementalism, sure, but I mean, if it happens and the government just kind of collapses, I plan on being set up to where it won't affect me at all.
So, like for instance, let's say there was an ANCAP revolution going on. Would you generally support the revolution, or would you
100%
criticize
I
it
would.
that they
No,
have to
100% I would
reform
support it.
more?
100% I would support it.
So for you, it's more just like either way, though probably when pressed on it, you would lean more towards incrementalism.
Right. Correct.
Yeah, because I would say for this, there's not too much disagreement. My only thing is I'm far more skeptical of revolutions or radical change. I think radical change, even if they have good motives or even if people think it's going to work out, oftentimes it doesn't. And even one point you brought up with welfare reform, I would actually say that for various welfare reform, where I do think there should be reform, that there should be various 5 to 10 year plans to start to try to get people off of welfare.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, it's
day one.
I mean, so while they're being paid with stolen money, I get it. But it's like at the same time, these people are relying on this to survive, and it's unfortunate. And I would love to help them get out of that, as I was helped get out of that. But that's the thing is like at the same time, I mean, if the government just kind of collapsed, I'm not going to shed a tear over it.
Yeah.
But yeah, obviously, I'd much rather help these people, get off the government teat as it is before that happens. But there's only so much that one man can do, right?
Yeah. So I guess my question for the revolution is, do you would you have any fears that the revolution, let's say, was a libertarian revolution? Maybe it could, if it's done too fast, turn into a different direction than what it was intended to be.
Oh, of course. There's no bigger enemy of libertarians than other libertarians. So 100%, yeah, it could absolutely turn into something I don't like. Of course.
Like versus if there's a 5 to 10 year plan, then it's more likely to go according to what the plan says.
Yeah, and like I said, I would be fine with that. But yeah. Yeah.
But it's just that if a revolution ever presented itself, like you would also like be fine with it.
Yeah.
Like if, let's say it just happened organically.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Because for that, I would say if a revolution happened organically, I would be skeptical. That's not to say it depends what it was.
Well, yeah, not just any revolution.
Skepticism of it.
Like a communist revolution, I would be 100% against. A socialist revolution, I'll be 100% against.
Well, let's say it was a revolution.
Neocon revolution, I would be 100% against. Right?
Well, let's say it was a revolution that, like, I supported. I would be a lot more skeptical of it.
Well, see, the thing is, with libertarians, like, I'm a lot less worried about them being in charge because generally they just want to leave you alone. So I wouldn't have as much of a problem with the libertarian revolution because they're not going to bother me. Most likely, right?
Yeah.
Unless they're somehow co-opted by another faction. But even if they're like libertarians that I don't agree with, they're probably not going to bother me.
Yeah, but the main thing is just that, like, if there's a revolution or if it happens too quickly, then there can be another faction which does rise and ultimately seize power compared to a plan to make sure opposition groups can't rise as quickly.
In which case I would stop supporting it as soon as it didn't represent my values, I would no longer support it.
Because, for instance, even one example is with Germany. There were a few people where with the KPD, or the Communist Party of Germany,
Yeah.
during the Great Depression, which did affect Germany due to the Wall Street crash. There were some people where they did think there was going to be a socialist revolution in Germany, and there were some where they were supportive of extremist parties. Well, wow, would you look at that? It turned out it was the Nazis that won and not the communists.
Right. I mean, we don't have to get into it, but I mean, fascists are just socialists for non-Marxists. So it's not really that much different than a socialist. It was a socialist revolution, just not a Marxist socialist revolution.
Yeah, either way, it was a socialist revolution in a
Yeah.
sense. A lot of people's assets got froze, and that some companies did get shut down. So there definitely was government cracking on the economy either way. But the point is that in Germany, there were some people who had sympathies towards socialism, where they liked the rapid rise in extremist parties, but it ended up paving the way to Nazis rather than communists, when honestly it could have gone either way. Like, if there's a
Yeah.
Monte Carlo simulation on it, maybe out of 1,000 times, probably I would say at least 25 to 30% of the time it would have been in favor of the communists.
Sure.
Versus if it was done more through a reform way, where the communists work with the social democrats at the time, and
Yeah.
they try to socialize the economy, versus basically this revolution. Well, it wasn't a revolution in the sense of takeover of the government through elections, but it was a rapid rise in extremist parties, which gave rise to that. Instead of having this rapid rise in extremist parties, you can just have reforms more in your direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that. And I mean, so I'm always going to support reforms towards a libertarian, direction. Doesn't mean that I support the government just because I say, okay, yeah, that's a better policy than what we have now. So, like, if they decided tomorrow to federally legalize marijuana, I would say, good. That's a good move. But that doesn't mean that I support the government any more than I did the day before. Right? It just means,
Yeah.
okay, we're moving more towards the way that I want to. Even if it's just a little bit, I'm always going to cheer on, a movement towards liberty as opposed to away from it.
Yeah.
So yeah, incrementalism or, whatever happens. But like I said, it's not going to affect me as much because my plan is to not be around where people are going to be bothering me like that.
Yeah, because I would say for this, there's not really too much in disagreement, where the only thing is I just lean more towards incrementalism, and
Yeah.
generally I am more skeptical of revolutions where I do think they can be co-opted,
Yeah, of course.
or other factions can rise. And not to say they haven't worked. I mean, even with the country of the US, it was founded upon the American Revolution. But it's just that I usually have more skepticism of it, where I kind of have to see whether it's going to work or not. Like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I get where you're coming from, and I don't disagree with you. Um, the only thing I would say is, yeah, the only exception would be, I think, a libertarian revolution, just because even if it's not there's a faction within libertarians who actually control most of the Libertarian Party, although that's quickly changing. But most Libertarian Party are what we might call like wokertarians, as in like they're very SJW ish, right? They're very much progressive libertarians, but I would still rather them be in charge than a neocon or a neoliberal, because they're not going to start a new war, right? They're not going to come and bother me. They're not going to, restrict guns anymore than the current government has, right? They're probably going to lessen gun restrictions. That's what the Libertarian Party platform is, right? They're going to decentralize the government, which is something that I would like more. Like, if we're not going to get rid of it, well, let's decentralize it, right? That's where I'm coming from. So, I would rather them be in charge, even if they're not ones that I would necessarily agree with ideologically. I would still prefer them.
Well, the main thing I would just say is that the issue of co-opting it is far less, in the sense of what you said. Even if it's not ideal, you still get a good option. I would say my concern more so is opposition groups, where whenever there's a power vacuum, it's very careful, where I would much rather prefer a plan to fill the power vacuum rather than a revolution, simply because even if there was a
Yeah.
libertarian revolution, it could easily go in the hands of socialists or other groups, because generally when extremism rise in one direction, and that's not to say extremism is a bad thing. So when I say like
Yeah,
the
yeah, I get what you mean.
libertarian revolution's extremists, I'm not
Yeah.
like downplaying or dismissing libertarians. It's just that
No, it's an
extremism
extreme
rises.
This
position.
does seem like
Yeah.
a good place to end the stream, unless there's
Yeah, I would
any
just
other-
close
Yeah,
by
for sure.
saying
Yeah, I'm
it
good.
just seems that extremists rise in all directions. And the same way, even if there's a libertarian revolution, guess what? A socialist could take power because they get more momentum, in the sense they're also anti-establishment. They're opposed to the current system.
Okay, so I'll just end with this, that I mean, so I mean, I don't want to it's all going to be speculation, right? But if socialists try and co-opt a libertarian revolution, I think they're going to get dealt with pretty quick, because I mean, libertarians are not fans of socialism whatsoever. And so if someone's advocating for socialist policies, or if once they get into power, like libertarians get into power, and then but the first thing they're going to do is start decentralizing power, which of course means that there's less power for the socialists to grab. Even if they do manage to get into a place of power, there's less of it there for them. So their effect is going to be much, much less because of the decentralization of power.
right? And I guess with that, unless anyone has any final things to say, that would be the stream. So is there any final things to say?
I'm good.
What? Going twice?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for for you two for showing up. And with that, I'll end the stream now. Tune in, subscribe if you haven't, so you can see more of my videos. And